Jerri Ward with I Object, Justice Examined, and I'm here with my good friend Alana Mercer, the classical liberal who writes some of the best columns I've ever read. I'm going to start off the show, as I usually do, talking to Alana about interesting things she's written. And just to let you know a little bit more about her, she's the author of Broadsides, One Woman's Clash with a Corrupt Culture. She's a fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Market Studies, an independent nonprofit economic policy think tank, and she writes a wonderful column every week for Walnut Daily. And she also maintains a great website called alanamercer.com. Alana, thanks for being with me today.
Hi, Jerri. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad to have you. Everything that you talk about is interesting and informative, and we picked out a subject today that's a little bit complicated, but I think is very interesting because I've kind of been going through a period where I'm trying to discover what exactly is conservatism, what exactly is classical liberalism, and as I've made this travel through literature and writings, I've discovered that things like anarchism have a totally different meaning than what I thought. There's also minarchism, and you wrote a blog posting recently that sort of talks about that in the context of our justice system. And the name of the blog posting was Against Anarchism, and it kind of started out in 2004, didn't it, when you wrote about a anarchist, I guess, analysis of the justice system and how he thought it should change from incarcerating people. Is that correct?
Yes, and certainly most libertarians, I believe, begin with being anarchists, and most of them, because certainly not very many thinkers are in the caliber of Murray Rothbard and Lysander Spooner or Randy Barnett, Hans Hermann Hoppe. They stick with anarchy because it's certainly sexy, anti-authoritarian, and it's kind of a rah-rah, fist in the air, I'm so anti-authoritarian type position. But I certainly have migrated back to the original idea of America, and that is the Lockean classical liberalism.
Well, one thing I want to make clear is anarchism doesn't mean you run amok in the streets committing violence.
We mean anarcho-capitalism, which is basically a society without the state, which sounds great.
Well, and you describe yourself as a minarchist. Why don't you define what you mean by that for everybody out there?
Well, I do believe that the state has a role in the production of defense, and that's basically it. As a defender of the Western tradition, I'm certainly, I have a very positive view of the accretive genius of the common law, and I think that the West has a very proud tradition in that sense. Has it gone wrong? Certainly, but the original idea of America, maybe the Articles of Confederation appealed to me more, but to the extent that the Constitution comports with the natural law, I certainly think it's a wonderful document.
Well, besides providing defense, I mean, one of the Old Testament views and also the views of our founding fathers is also that the government is the ministry of justice, that it makes sure that there's justice in our legal system, and that's certainly compatible with minarchist ideas, isn't it?
Yes, and of course it's very difficult to hold that vision that we had with what's unfolding these days. With the bloated behemoth that the state has become. But certainly, I see the law as a public declaration of a few abiding, immutable values that hold us together.
Well, one thing I've been really concerned about has been the state of our justice system, because it is peopled and run by infallible human beings, and there are a lot of things about it that I think are going off track. And one thing that libertarians have been talking about in 2004, and especially I've noticed lately, is that they estimate that about a quarter of our population is actually incarcerated. I don't know if that's a inflated number. I've just read that number on some libertarian sites. But that was one of the issues you dealt with, because an anarchist named David, what is it, Heinrich, wrote about changing our criminal justice system to one of restitution rather than one of incarceration, and you were responding to him. Is that right?
Well, I guess I'm the wrong person to talk about the philosophy at length undergirding this, but libertarian anarchists essentially would like to see punishment replaced by a system of, privately administered financial restitution. And they begin this with cunningly often conflating punishment with vengeance and restitution with justice. Something that immediately will jump out at you as an illogic, and it's very similar to the left liberal penal abolitionists.
Well, I have read Professor Bruce Benson's book, The Enterprise of Law, where he does indeed talk about restitution as the basis of the judicial system, and goes back into history to see how that was applied in other societies.
And of course, let me just interject and say very homogenous societies like the Japanese, highly conservative culture where losing face alone can serve as a means to get people to, obey consensus and cultural norms.
Well, and in other places in the Arabic culture. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in Iraq, I've read about some of the families of civilians who were killed in firefights, their interest being in gaining justice through being recompensed for the deaths of their family members. And in fact, I read a theory that in Haditha that one of the driving factors behind that was not so much to incarcerate these soldiers, but rather to gain compensation for the victims in their family from that firefight.
Sure, but that would be because of the limiting presence of the American military. I think if it were up to them, they would probably do very bad things to those soldiers.
Yes, that's probably correct.
Which they would see as immutably, naturally just.
Right. Well, getting back to this idea of punishment, or rather restitution rather than punishment, in a way, I think that these libertarians are off track, because if you go back to Old Testament traditions, there was a mixture of both. Because I think both you and I agree that victims are not compensated enough, that in fact in our justice system victims are treated terribly.
Absolutely, but the idea is that, at least my notion is that the fact that the state is so unjust and has gone so off track, as you know, being on the cusp of all this as a lawyer, is not a sufficient reason to support a state of affairs whereby, natural justice doesn't necessarily become the goal of justice. In other words, proportionate moral retribution need not be part of a private solution.
Well, do you have any opinion about the numbers of people that we're incarcerating? I mean, I have problems with incarcerating people who've committed victimless crimes.
Oh, of course. No, I agree with the libertarian statistics on that, and all people that are assaulted because of the things that they consume or ingest or inject should be immediately let go.
Well, and also in the case...
I mean, this is all behavior that is lawful by natural law standards.
Yes, and in the case of some crimes that are based on criminal negligence, sometimes I believe that restitution to the victims might be a more effective means of dealing with those crimes as well. Do you agree or disagree?
Absolutely.
With that?
I mean, when redress for misdemeanors already is often handled through mediation and so on, and these are perfectly private solutions to nonviolent offenses.
But it would have to be a private solution that doesn't involve insurance to truly be punishment. Well, Alana, tell us the subject of your column in WorldNet Daily tomorrow.
Well, titles always change, but I'm going to be speaking about bimbos, not bombs. In other words, I'm going to be suggesting, as an antidote to the politics out there, which I find so tedious, and the politicians have overexhausted their welcome, that we export women, American women, to our enemies and bring them to their knees.
Well, that should be interesting. Well, thanks for being with me.
But not you, Jerry. Absolutely
okay,
not
good.
you.
Well, thanks for being with me today, Alana.
Okay, dear. See you in 14.
That's right.
Bye.
Bye. My next guests are going to engage in a debate. I'm very proud to announce that we're going to have a debate here on I Object, Justice Examined between two eminent scholars on the subject of the minimum wage. And to the right, we are going to have Dr. Walter Block, who earned his Ph.D. in economics at Columbia University. He is a very prolific author and editor and co-editor of many books. He's written many journal articles. Some of his books include Defending the Undefendable, Lexicon of Economic Thought, Man, Economy, and Liberty, essays in honor of Murray N. Rothbard. Plus, he's contributed to journals such as the Review of Austrian Economics, Journal of Libertarian Studies, and the Journal of Labor Economics. He is currently a professor and chair of economics at the College of Business Administration at Loyola University. And to the left, we have Dr. Jarad Bernstein, who joined the Economic Policy Institute in 1992, and he has a new book out called Crunch, Why Do I Feel So Squeezed, and Other Unsolved Economic Mysteries, which follows a book that he wrote earlier, All Together Now, Common Sense for a Fair Economy. And he researches in the area of income inequality and mobility and trends in employment and earnings, low-wage labor markets and poverty, and other areas. He's also the co-author of 8 editions of the book, The State of Working America. He holds a Ph.D. in social welfare from Columbia University. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here with you, Jerri.
That's great. Well, I think to start out this debate, probably what we ought to do is have Dr. Bernstein, since he advocates the minimum wage and also an increase in the minimum wage. Dr. Bernstein, why don't you spend about 3 minutes making your case about why the minimum wage is a good thing and why it should be raised?
Sure. The minimum wage is an important floor, if you will, on the labor market. There are a great deal of pressures on low-wage workers in our economy, and since the 1930s, when minimum wages were first introduced, we've recognized that if left to their own devices, market forces will push the wages of low-wage workers down to privation levels that are unacceptable to Congress and to society. And it's not just market forces. There's discrimination in play. There's a lack of bargaining power. Sometimes our lowest wage, least advantaged workers are heavily exploited and paid a lot less what they ought to be. The economics theory or textbook analysis of minimum wage is quite clear. It suggests that if you raise a minimum wage or impose a mandate that's 1 penny above what the supposedly market wage would dictate, all these workers would lose their jobs. And when I was in grad school learning these theories, I learned that the minimum wage was a terrible idea for that very reason. But then I learned that you can't trust the theory. You actually have to go into the data and see how these wage changes play out in the real world. And I'm sure Walter and I will have a lot of arguments about what those data show. But I feel very, very strongly, and I want our listeners to recognize that theory alone cannot answer this question. You have to get down to cases, because the cases have shown time and again, highest quality research we have, I think, in economics, have shown that moderate increases in the minimum wage absolutely do not have that old textbook effect. They have the desired effect of helping to offset the very problems I've mentioned. The research has been so convincing that the new textbooks are saying different things than the old textbooks.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bernstein. And Dr. Block, do you want to respond to that? And also, if you will, include what other factors you think might be forcing or might be causing income inequalities?
Well, in my view, Jarad Bernstein correctly articulates the view that it's a floor under wages. That is the argument in favor of minimum wages. I think most people see it as a floor. You raise the floor, and you raise everyone's wages to whatever the minimum wage level is. I don't see it that way at all. I see it rather as a hurdle over which you have to jump in order to get a job, because the minimum wage law isn't an employment law, it's an unemployment law. It says it shall be illegal to pay anyone less than whatever the minimum wage level is, say $5.15 or $6 an hour, or whatever it is. It doesn't say that anyone has to be hired. It just says you can't pay less than whatever the stipulated wage is. But we have to dig a little deeper, and we have to ask, why is it that employers want to pay wages to employees in the first place? And the answer is productivity in general, or marginal revenue productivity if you want to be technical. Namely, the employer is paying the worker because of what he can add to his bottom line. So, suppose you have a teenage worker whose productivity is, $3 an hour. That means that if you hire him, your bottom line is $3 an hour better than it would be if you didn't hire him. Well, now, if the law says that you have to hire him at $5 or not at all, it's pretty clear that you won't hire him at all. Because if you do, you lose $2 an hour on him, and we're assuming profit maximizing or profit-seeking behavior. And if you do that, then why would the employer want to hire the employee at all? So that's why I say it's not a floor. It doesn't raise anyone's wages. Rather, it makes it very difficult for people whose productivity is below the level stipulated by the minimum wage law to get a job at all. Because if you hire someone whose productivity is $3 an hour and you have to pay him $5, you lose $2 an hour. Now, it's not for nothing that we have special exemptions from the minimum wage law. For example, for teenagers, we have a special lower minimum wage law for teenagers. We have a special lower minimum wage law for mentally handicapped workers, not physically handicapped workers, because physically handicapped workers have very high productivities. For example, we could have this debate between Professor Bernstein and myself if we were both in wheelchairs. But if you're mentally handicapped, then your wages, your productivity is way lower. So if the minimum wage law is really a floor, why have exemptions? I mean, that's very non-charitable, very callous. And also, if it's such a great idea, why be so niggardly about that? And I hope and trust no one thinks I'm using the N-word here. Why be so niggardly? Why raise it, $5, $6, $7 an hour? Why not raise it, $100, $1,000, $1 million an hour? And then in one fell swoop, with the passage of a legislative pen, we could, solve poverty. We'd all be rich. Now, Dr. Bernstein says it's not just a matter.
Can we stick to our 3-minute rule here?
Why don't we let Dr. Bernstein? We have a little less than 2 minutes left on this. I noticed on your website, or that the Economic Policy Institute, that you guys dispute that this causes unemployment. Do you want to discuss that a little bit?
I don't want to cut Walter off. I just want to. Do you really want to say 3 minutes each, or not?
Well, why don't you go ahead and respond at this point? We only have about a minute and a half left on this particular segment.
Okay, is that all right with you, Walter?
I don't mind. I don't mind when you interrupt me. If I had the incorrect view, I'd probably be interrupting you.
Oh, now, Walter, that sounds a little rude. Be nice.
Well, you were the one that interrupted me.
No, I'm just saying that I thought the understanding was we each got 3 minutes. You had gone on for longer than that.
Right, but right now you're wasting time, so why don't you respond?
No, I don't want to. Go ahead, Walter, finish. I don't want to interrupt. I just was trying to get the rules straight. Please, finish, Walter.
Well, I think what Dr. Bernstein said was that it's a matter of both theory and data and cases, and I'd like to discuss that, but I think the music is sort of cutting me off. Is that right, Jerry?
Well, we got 30 seconds, and
okay, well, if you people who are listening out there in Radio Land, if you put a supply and demand curve on a piece of paper, the equilibrium wage is where supply and demand crosses, and a minimum wage above that level will absolutely, definitively, apodictically cause unemployment of people below that level.
Okay, well, and we're going to be right back after the break, and we'll let Dr. Bernstein reply.
Are you a business?
We're back with the academic-heavy debate with Dr. Walter Block and Dr. Jarad Bernstein, and we're going to start right back with Dr. Bernstein. And Dr. Bernstein, why don't you reply to the assertion by Dr. Block that the minimum wage is an unemployment law as opposed to an employment law?
Well, I think what Walter was espousing there was very much the theoretical view that I mentioned in my opening statement, and I totally agree that is what theory used to predict around minimum wages. It doesn't really do so anymore, so Walter's a little out of date in that regard. And the reason it doesn't do so anymore is because, as I said and I tried to stress, we can argue about theory all day long, but we'll never get to the nub of the issue, because theory used to very simply predict that if you raise somebody's wage above their, quote, marginal product, above their, quote, value to the firm, that person would lose their job. That's precisely where Walter's insights on this are coming from. The problem is that we have tested that theory, and in economics, if you don't test a theory, it's really not worth very much. This is not hard science. It's soft science in that regard. You have to see how these things play out in real life.
How do you test it, and what's your data?
Okay, so here's the thing. In 1996, the minimum wage at the federal level was increased from $4.25 to $5.15 an hour. That's the federal minimum wage. But at the same time, over 30 states now have minimum wages that are above the federal level. And this has presented economists with the opportunity to do something we almost never get to do in economics, which is pseudo-experimentation. That is, we can actually go into the data and compare places that are entirely similar in every way we can find. I mean, their economies are similar, their labor forces are similar, the people who live there are similar, except one is different than the other. One has higher minimum wages and one has lower minimum wages. That's precisely the kind of pseudo-experimental test you'd need to do to see if the theories that Walter was espousing, those supply and demand curves he wants everyone to draw, really make sense, really play out in the real world. And what that research has shown is that the minimum wage has absolutely nothing like the kind of impact that Walter suggested. We have never, ever had an experience where raise the minimum wage and every affected worker loses their job, which is precisely Walter's, the empirical outcome of Walter's argument. This is not to say that no one has ever been disemployed or lost a job due to a minimum wage increase. Of course, there's no policy that's perfect in that regard. But some studies show a slight positive effect. Actually, minimum wage led to greater employment growth. Some studies show slightly negative effect. Most studies hover around zero, and the punchline is that these policies have their intended effect. They raise the earnings of workers at the bottom of the wage scale, leaving the vast majority of them better off and employed. Now, Walter said, "What happened?"
Well, let me break in because I need to give Dr. Block a chance to comment on the data and the studies. And Dr. Block, do you think that this? Have you examined this data? What do you think of the legitimacy of it? Is it even really a good approach to analyzing this subject?
No, I don't think that data is very important or very indicative of anything.
And why is that?
Because other things change. If a minimum wage law rises and these people don't lose their jobs and instead they get higher pay, something else must have changed also. You can't control everything. We live in a very complex economy. Now, I'm not saying that every worker loses his job right away. There was an interesting historical case. Dr. Bernstein is interested in history and empirical analysis. What happened is in the 40s, I think it was the 40s or the 50s, the minimum wage law went up from 40 to 75 cents, which was the highest percentage raise. And when it was 40 cents, all elevators were manually operated. Then it rose to 75 cents. How many elevator operators, how many manual elevator operators do you think got fired in the next second? Zero. None. Because it takes a little while to put in automatic elevators. And yet over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, all the elevators went from manual to automatic. And it takes a little bit of understanding of economics to realize that the cause of it was not higher interest rates or this or that or real estate values, but because of the minimum wage. at a 40-cent minimum wage, these low-skilled workers, relatively low-skilled workers, were very competitive with the high-skilled workers behind the automatic elevators. But at 75 cents, they lost their competitive advantage. Now, again, this isn't an econometric study, but I noticed I went to Dr. Bernstein's webpage, or at least the Economic Policy Institute, with which he is associated, and they listed no fewer than 35 studies, all of which indicate what he is saying, namely that the minimum wage law is a floor, not a hurdle over which you have to jump to get a job. Interestingly enough, out of the 35, only 19 of them were actually published. The rest were just working papers or discussion papers or unpublished papers. Now, if you compare that number of studies, econometric studies, with the number of studies showing the opposite, there were literally thousands. So while I don't think that these empirical studies mean much, I'm much more of a theoretician, but when it comes to the empirical studies, I would estimate that, 75, 80, 85% of all empirical studies that have been published indicate that the minimum wage law is a hurdle, not a floor. So even on the grounds of empirical, statistical, econometric studies, it's very clear that the theory is correct. This theory doesn't change. This is basic theory. It's similar to, triangles have 360 degrees. You don't test that. You can only illustrate that.
Well, let me get back to Dr. Bernstein, and I'd like you to respond to that, Dr. Bernstein, but I'd also like you to answer the question, a question I have is, why should the government have the right to do this? So if you could both respond and answer that.
Let me respond to Walter first and you second. On our website, we have examples of minimum wage research from all sides of the issue, but I will say Walter's correct in that we don't have 70 years of research, and that the old research, I would argue, is probably closer to the kinds of arguments that Walter's making, though not nearly so far-reaching. So, for example, the old minimum wage research, and I'm thinking of really the conventional wisdom setting research, which was done by an economist named Charles Brown, and really kind of set the stage for years until this new pseudo-experimentation got underway. That suggested that if you raise the minimum wage 10%, 1 to 3% of affected teenagers would lose their jobs. Okay? So 99 to 97%, or 97 to 99% would keep their jobs and get a pay raise, but 1 to 3% would lose jobs. That's the old research. And by the way, I stress teenagers because this research could not find an effect on older workers. And by the way, Walter makes a very good point about capital equipment replacing workers. But the research that's worth its salt in this work accounts for that by having what economists called lagged indicators. That is, we're looking at the impact of not the minimum wage just today on employment, but the minimum wage last year and the year before and well before that. Now, Walter, I think, really shows his hand in a way that I would argue is pretty much a checkmate for my side in this debate, which is that he said, look, this is pure theory. You can't test it. It's just not testable. It's like it's just by definition. And, I absolutely think that that's the wrong way to view this. These kinds of economic principles have to be tested and tested carefully. Now, Alan Blinder, by the way, former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, Joe Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate in economics, okay? There aren't too many of those. Both of them have changed their thinking on this based on this new research. Blinder, I'm going to quote him, "My thinking on this has changed dramatically. The evidence appears to be against the simple-minded theory that a modest increase in the minimum wage causes substantial job loss." Okay, that is a former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, one of the top economists in the country. I could quote Stiglitz as well, Nobel laureate. Now, your point was, well, why should the government have a right to do this?
Yes, or have the power to do this.
I think that was challenged. I think there was a Supreme Court challenge of that. Walter may know this better than I. Back somewhere in the 30s or 40s, and the challenge failed. I mean, the government is actually able to intervene in markets in lots of different ways with regulations. In this case, it's under the Fair Labor Standards Act. That set a set of standards, rules, regulations, including overtime law, minimum wages, basic labor practices that firms have to observe. A well-established right.
So basically, because a bunch of men in black robes say it's okay, it's okay. It's what
that's
I'm
something
gathering.
called. I mean, it sounds like you may object to our legal system.
Well, in some respects, I do. And
okay.
Dr. Block, what do you think of the analysis, his analysis of why the government should have this power?
Well, I don't think they should have the power. I think it's a violation of contract. We believe in capitalist acts between consenting adults, and the idea of putting people in jail for offering a wage below a stipulated minimum and that people agree to just seems very unconscionable to me. But what I wanted to do is get into this Blinder comment. What he said is a modest increase, and he also said that a 10% increase will only increase 10% increase will only increase the unemployment by 1 to 3%. Well, 1 to 3% is 1 to 3% too many, and also it depends upon the time elapsed. As I said, when something occurs, the market doesn't react immediately. To get that 3% or 1%, the lag was very short. But if time goes on, then it'll be bigger. But look, you see, Blinder says a modest increase, so you're talking 10%. But why should it be a 10%? If it's really a floor in the wages, why not raise it to $100 an hour? Now, Blinder or Stiglitz or any of those very famous economists who misunderstand economics, they would be appalled. This is an utter refutation. Now, look, when I say that it's absolute necessity that the minimum wage law will create unemployment, I'm not saying by definition. I'm saying based on the logic of it. And the logic is time immemorial. It doesn't change over time. If you're assuming profit maximizing behavior and the wage is higher than the productivity, then the guy can't keep his job. It's just a matter of finding out alternative arrangements. Now, look, the reason older workers aren't affected is because older workers have higher productivity, and they can jump over the hurdle. It's younger workers who can't. That's why you have to have an exception. The teenage minimum wage is, something like $2 an hour, whereas 2 or 3.
Well, I'm going to cut you off right here because I don't know that Dr. Bernstein can be on the last part. So you have about 30 seconds, Dr. Bernstein, to sum up sum yourself up.
Sure. First of all, the 1 to 3%, as I mentioned, that I didn't get it. I wasn't able to finish. That's the old research. The new research, which actually looks carefully at these empirical tests, completely undermines this. I would say pretty simple-minded notion that workers are somehow paid their marginal product or their productivity. Ask yourself why the top 5 hedge fund managers last year earned $12.6 billion. We simply don't have a good, solid notion of paying people what they're worth. We get in the ballpark, but we don't nail it. And that's one of the reasons why we need what I think Blinder correctly characterized as modest increases in the minimum wage in order to help people get a fair shake without leading to job loss.
Well, great. And
thank you very much for hosting the debate.
Yeah, well, thank you for being on the debate. And if you can hang on for just a second as we go into this break, that would be great. And then I'm going to be back with Dr. Block after the break.
I speak for both of us when I say you did it.
If you're a man or...
Hello, I'm back with I Object, Justice Examined, and Dr. Walter Block was able to stay over with me. I mentioned to everyone earlier in the introduction that he is involved with Austrian economics, which, although it's called Austrian economics, to me it's the real economics. And Dr. Block, why don't you explain to people what is Austrian economics and how is it distinct from other areas in economics?
Well, first of all, Austrian economics has nothing to do with the economics of the country Austria. The reason it's named Austrian economics, and you have to make that point, I think, is because the leaders of it, the founding fathers of it, Menger, Bombewerk, Mises, Hayek, all came from Austria. Similarly, you have the Chicago School of Economics after Milton Friedman and George Stigler. It's got nothing to do with the economics of Chicago. It just so happens that it started at the University of Chicago in Chicago. Now, the difference is that the main difference is methodological. Austrians see economics as a branch of logic, not as a branch of empirical science. So for us, the claim that trade is mutually beneficial in the ex ante sense, which means suppose I buy a newspaper for $1. It means that in the anticipation sense, I value the newspaper more than $1, and the newspaper vendor values my dollar more than the newspaper's. Now, how are you going to test that? You really can't test that. If you understand the English language, you understand. Now, later on, I might regret it. I might find there was no news or something, and I regret my purchase. But at the time of purchase, it's absolutely undeniable, not definitional, but apodictically true, that I value the newspaper more than the buck, and the newspaper vendor values my buck more than the newspaper. Otherwise, why are we making the deal? Now, for the Austrian, all of economics is like that. It's a series of axioms that you deduce and infer from. And what you do when you go out into the real world and do econometric studies, which Austrians also do, is we don't test these theories. These theories are undeniable. Rather, we illustrate them. So
are they like transcendent principles?
Yes, that's a very good word, transcendent principles. That are, it's sort of like geometry. I mean, the Pythagorean theorem is true transcendentally, and you don't test it. If it doesn't work, it shows that you don't have a triangle.
Well, one thing I want to get in here, it sounds like Dr. Bernstein is Keynesian. Is he Keynesian?
He may well be. I wouldn't put it past him, but what he said about the minimum wage law doesn't definitively tie him as a Keynesian. It just defines him, as far as I can see, as a person who doesn't understand the functioning of the minimum wage law. Well, you see, this thing he was talking about, this controlled experiment, you have two states nearby, one next to the other. There was a famous study of New Jersey and Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And they had different minimum wages, and then they had different unemployment rates for teenage or unskilled workers. Other economists tried to replicate that, and they couldn't. And one of the mainstays of empirical studies is that other researchers should be able to replicate this. What they found, it was very sloppy. They interviewed people on the phone. They didn't know who they got on the phone. And when they tried to replicate it later, there were businesses that went broke and were no longer available to be interviewed. So you didn't really have a controlled experiment. Now, there are sort of controlled experiments like North and South Korea, East and West Germany, where you had a lot of things that were similar, only you had a different economic system, and then you had very different results. So I'm not unappreciative of that. I'm just saying, if we're going to do it, let's not do it in a sloppy way. Let's do it in a meaningful way. And these studies are not meaningful. They're a very small proportion of all econometric studies are the Blinder and Stiglitz kind of studies. The overwhelming majority of empirical studies shows just what Austrian economists expect, namely, the higher the minimum wage law, the more unemployment for people who have productivity levels below the level stipulated by the law.
Well, another point is that one distinction between Austrian economics and the Chicago School with its econometrics and Keynesians is that the Austrian school totally disavows central planning, whereas the other disciplines seem to at least advocate some level of central planning, which to me is what a minimum wage is. And also deciding to have a minimum wage based on these statistics or these numbers.
Well, I think what you're saying is historically accurate, but not philosophically accurate. In other words, both Austrian economics and mainstream economics, whether Chicagoan or Keynesian, and Chicagoans are Keynesians, is a value-free science, whereas libertarianism is a value-laden discipline. So an Austrian, qua Austrian, couldn't say the minimum wage law is good or bad or just or unjust. He could just say, or she, that it has thus and such effect. Now, it just so happens that you're absolutely right that virtually all Austrians, without exception, are very free enterprise, and the Chicagoans and the Keynesians and the Marxists certainly are not. But it's not because they're speaking qua economists, because an Austrian could favor central planning, like if he was a misanthrope and hated people. He could say, look, I realize that central planning will screw up the economy, but I hate people and I want to screw up the economy, so I favor central planning. Now, I don't know that there are any like that, but there could be one like that. So we have to be very careful when we're treading on philosophical thin ice.
Well, why don't you tell me in the little time we have left, where do you see our economy heading right now?
Well, thanks to Dr. Bernstein's buddies in Washington, Bernanke and other central planners in Washington, D.C., it's in a very, very poor state. For the Austrians, when the government creates successive money supplies or even has fiat currency as opposed to the gold standard, what they do is they create inflation and they create the business cycle by artificially lowering interest rates below the level that would otherwise obtain, and thus encouraging investment in very heavy basic industries that can't be sustained based on the savings and consumption decisions of the populace. In addition, what they did on the housing market and the the corn market with oil.
The commodities.
They're making corn into fuel and
the commodities.
Right, and creating all sorts of starvation around the world and high food prices. And what the Boston Fed thought they found out that there was discrimination against black people because businesses weren't lending them home mortgages. Really, it was because they didn't have collateral and they didn't have a good financial record. So what the government made banks do is give people mortgage loans where they had no collateral, where they had to make zero down payments, so they had no equity in the house whatsoever. And then the financial institutions catapulted on top of this lousy paper. So that created the housing crisis. It's sort of like 1929 when the government screwed up the monetary policy and then they had the Smoot-Hawley tariff. I tell you, if Hillary or Barack get in and they start in with their protectionism, that'll be just like Smoot-Hawley, and it might be the final straw in creating another 1929 depression. So I'm not a big fan of the economy. I don't think we have free enterprise. I think we've got socialism and fascism here.
And also, the government screwed it up, but they're going to try to shift the blame to someone else by demonizing, these companies, the mortgage companies and all that, when they create the mess. That's what government does. Yes,
well, it's greed and capitalism that are always to blame for these people, and it's just nonsense on stilts. The real cause is we don't have laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah. According to the government, it's never misjudgment or cronyism on their part, is it?
Oh, no. Certainly not. How could you even think that? I'm ashamed of you, Jerri.
Well, Dr. Block, thank you so much for being with me today. It's always a pleasure to have you, and we'll have you and Dr. Bernstein back for part 2 of the debate later in the year.
That'll be wonderful.
Thank you for being with me. And we are coming up on a break, so stay tuned.
Get a free...
Well, it's Jerri Ward back for the very last segment of today's I Object, Justice Examined. And as everyone, I hope, knows out there, this is a twice-monthly show, and I will be back on the air same day, Thursday, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And hopefully I'll have another action-packed show like we had today. I mean, we really ran the gamut of topics today, all the way from anarchism, minarchism, and the restitution-based justice system idea to Keynesianism and the Chicago School and Austrian economics. I hope everybody out there enjoyed the debate between Dr. Bernstein and Dr. Block, and also enjoyed Dr. Block's talk about the economy. And one thing I'm going to have to do someday is, I was just talking to John on the break, and John's got some great ideas about economics. He's really good at it, and someday maybe I can have him debate Dr. Block, because he sort of disagrees with the idea of total free enterprise, which obviously Dr. Block believes in, being a libertarian and essentially an anarcho-capitalism or capitalist. everyone can read Dr. Block's work at the von Mises Institute, and if you just Google his name, he's a very prolific writer. You can read all his information. Also, if you Google the Economic Policy Institute and Dr. Jarad Bernstein, you can also read his work. And like I said, when I introduced him, he does have a new book out, Crunch, Why Do I Feel So Squeezed, and Other Unsolved Economic Mysteries. So if you want to get some ammunition or find out what leftist center people are saying about the minimum wage, go buy that book at Amazon.com. Thanks for being with me today. And I will be back, like I said, in about 2 weeks, and I will have a good show for you then that's just as exciting. Be back in 2 weeks.
This is Right Talk Radio.